Welcome to Insurance Suits, a podcast brought to you by AIMCO, the American Association of Insurance Management Consultants. I am Chantel Roberts. My co-host, Amy Johnson, will hopefully be joining us shortly, but in the interim, I have Dirk Beamer. So I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You got it right.
Good. So Dirk, how are you?
Well, thanks.
Good. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So tell us a little bit about your specialty or field inside the insurance mechanism. Welcome to the Insurance Suits podcast, a bi-monthly podcast brought to you by AIMCO, discussing the issues and the people who are involved in insurance. The views expressed by the moderators and guests represent their own views and opinions, and not necessarily the views and opinions of AIMCO, Insurance Suits, or its advertisers.
Work a lot with them in both settings in transactions involving acquisition or selling of a book of business.
So a lot of mergers and acquisition aspects.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, that I think is emotionally fraught with a lot of energy, I guess, or I guess I should say it has a lot of energy with a lot of emotion in it.
Yeah, certainly for a seller, very often this agency has been what someone's poured their life into. And very often it's a family affair with spouses working together, maybe multiple generations working together. So the decision to sell can be difficult, and separating the emotion from the nuts and bolts or just the business realities can be a challenge sometimes.
So how do you do that? I guess you're part psychologist, part business analyst as well.
Well, anytime we approach a transaction, we try to be sensitive to where people are coming from, but at the end of the day, we do have to remind folks that it is a business and it is a business proposition, and certainly the other side is going to be looking at it as a business proposition. So hopefully you find a business solution that likewise addresses the personal needs of the agency owner, of the family. Remind them that the reason they're going down this road is to take care of their family, take care of their retirement, take care of generations of people who they need to protect.
Right. Okay. So how did you get into this part? Were you an agent before and you sold your business, or how did you get into?
No, it was nothing logical, nothing planned. In the late 90s, my law firm had a relationship with some local Allstate agency owners and represented them in a lawsuit against AT&T or the local Ma Bell Yellow Pages back in the day. Through that relationship, we got to know the gentleman who was the association manager for the National Association of Professional Allstate Agents. Shortly thereafter, Allstate made the dramatic move of terminating all of their employee agents, converting them to independent contractors who had, for the first time, the opportunity to sell their books of business. So while we were representing the association and still do, through that, we started to understand better the contract and the opportunities Allstate agents had to sell books. And that really has just blossomed over 20 years to where we spend a lot of time helping both captive and independent agency owners merge, acquire, sell their books of business.
So what do you find is the most, excuse me, the most interesting part of it, the merging of it or the actual selling?
Yeah, they both have interesting aspects. I guess I would say maybe the selling is a little bit more satisfying, again, because how important it is to the selling agent or agency owner. And it's a very stressful process often for them. So I take it seriously, and I consider it a privilege to help walk them through and kind of assure them that we're going to get to the finish line, and then making sure that happens.
So what is something that people seem to misunderstand the most about what you do specifically?
Mm-hmm. I think people don't appreciate necessarily what the purpose of a transactional agreement is, a purchase agreement, whether it's a stock purchase or more typically it's an asset purchase. I don't think they realize sometimes the complexity of it and the various functions it's serving. So the agreement can seem oftentimes very lengthy, very detailed, and it really, I tell people from a buyer's perspective, that agreement is serving as an insurance policy. So it really is letting that buyer know that it has certain protections if things don't pan out as represented.
I think that's important. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because some of our previous guests have mentioned the fact that you have documentation, and documentation really saves you. And as an adjuster, I always drilled into, or as a claims manager, I always drilled into my adjusters, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. And we had some previous agents on there that also talked about this very same thing. And I think that that's what's important, that if something is not written down in your buy-sell agreement or your merger agreement, they can promise that they're going to keep your name, they're going to, keep all your employees or whatever. But if it's not specifically in there, you don't have that if they go ahead and that protection if they do fire you.
The lack of documentation and sufficient documentation is a real challenge. And for whatever reason, a lot of times agency owners, they've built very successful businesses, but they don't necessarily approach this transaction as a business transaction. Sometimes, candidly, they want to do things on the cheap. And penny wise is pound foolish, because what you assume to be true is dangerous. And if you say, well, I have a buddy who sold his agency 2 years ago, and I'll just take his documentation and change the names, and I'll use it for mine and save some money, that is when problems surface, because I don't pretend to understand exactly how coverages work. That's not my expertise. I would call an agent to explain that to me. Likewise, lawyers do what they do for a reason, and those terms and provisions on those contracts are there for a reason. So it really is important that they understand and that they apply specifically to the deal at hand.
Speaking of attorneys, we've just been joined by Amy Johnson, who is the co-host. Amy, this is Dirk, Amy.
Good morning,
Dirk,
Amy.
it's so nice to meet you. And I'm, as Chantal is constantly hearing from me, I apologize for being late.
Well, you have a meeting, I think, right at that. It ends at 8:30 or something, and
Yes.
that's when we're recording. So we should probably move that back a little bit.
Well, it's a weekly meeting
Yeah.
with the partners at my firm, and it never goes beyond 8:30, of course, on the day I have this scheduled.
Well, sure.
Here we
I mean,
go.
yeah, there you go. So Dirk is involved in agency mergers, acquisitions, buying, selling, and he's been telling us all about that. We just got finished talking about some of the documentations about how you have to have that documentation, which you and I have been talking about. Fred talked about, Leslie talked about in the buy-sell agreement, because it's like an insurance policy. What we just talked about, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. So. This episode of Insurance Suits is sponsored by the American Association of Insurance Management Consultants, or AMCO, a nonprofit trade association comprised of insurance and risk professionals ranging from actuarial, underwriting, acquisition and transactions, and adjuster, agent, and broker standards of care. Find out more at www.aaimco.com.
Dirk, I have a question for you, and we can put it off if you guys are right in the middle of talking about a particular topic. But it was interesting. Last year I drafted an agency buy-sell agreement for a small agent downstate Illinois who was purchasing a much larger agency from someone who was retiring. And, you know, doing my due diligence, I did some additional research to find out, you know, are there specific provisions that they gave me a draft. Let me step back. They gave me a draft of what they were working on, which me as a lawyer just about fainted. But, you know, it was pretty interesting that these two parties hadn't put in their draft how the E&O insurance was going to be handled, whether it was going to be keeping the name of the agency and adding the owner, the seller, if there was going to be tail coverage, those kinds of things. And so what are the few top 5, top 3 things that you would absolutely insist get worked out that people don't often think about putting in there? I mean, I was surprised that insurance agents weren't contemplating insurance.
Yeah, right. Well, that's an excellent one, certainly, is figuring out from a, again, I have to say, I'm oftentimes amused that and surprised that agents who are selling are trying to figure out how quickly they can stop paying for insurance. Where, you know, I would think spending a career in the industry, you would recognize the value of it. But from a buyer's perspective, certainly requiring as a condition of the transaction that the selling agent maintains tail coverage, and figuring out how that's, you know, what the limits are going to be and how that's going to be paid for is certainly very important. Understanding exactly what ability the seller has to move certain portions of the book is important and is not a given. There may be a separate contract, you know, if they're working, you know, through a larger broker, there may be separate contractual provisions that limit their ability to just turn around and hand the book over. And that really has to be understood very clearly and explained and documented. You know, that it should be obvious that non-competition and non-solicitation provisions are going to be very important. And people get confused. They're used to hearing about those provisions in an employment context. And maybe because of that, they've learned, well, there's a limit to how far those can go. Or maybe I'm in a state like California where in an employment context, these really aren't probably going to be enforceable. That's completely different in this context of buying and selling an agency or a book of business. And in that context, they are enforceable. They most definitely can be negotiated, and they can be negotiated for a much longer window of time than what you would expect to see in an employment context.
That's a great point. And the difference between solicitation and non-compete as well was something that we really had to go over. Do you ever see provisions on cooperation of the transition by the seller? Because that was something that everyone got along, so they didn't think that would be an issue.
Yeah, and that can be sometimes it's a very limited period of transition, and you deal with it just as a term within the purchase agreement. A lot of times, and probably better, is you have a separate consulting agreement or employment agreement for some window of time that's pretty specific in terms of what the expectations are of the selling agency owner, or maybe it's her spouse or somebody who's been key in the operation and who is going to stick around for a while. And from a buyer's perspective, maybe you can tie that with some piece of consideration, some of the financing or funding, so that you're kind of holding that person to their commitment. And until they've completed that commitment, they're not going to see 100% of the purchase price.
Oh, that's a great point. Do you see any trends looking back to, several years ago or even longer to today where people's focus is?
Certainly, again, in the captive world, it used to be more common that you could perhaps get a sale that was all cash. The reality
Okay.
has become such that it's almost a given that there will be a piece of seller financing. And even in the independent, if there's a lender involved, they're probably going to require that the selling agency owner carry a note and finance a piece of it. And I think the basic motivation there is to make sure that that selling agent is invested in the ongoing success of the agency, and kind of financially motivated not to compete, but instead to see it succeed because they need to get paid their balance as well.
Right. Okay.
When we talked a little bit about the non-competition, non-solicitation, piracy clauses are popular, and whether or not you negotiate a specific penalty used to be maybe a bit more popular than what I see more recently. I think that's practically because they can be difficult to measure, to assess. That's why I prefer a blanket.
This is really fascinating, and I'm glad that Amy is here because I honestly don't know anything about buy-sell agreements except for when one was done for the adjusting company that I worked for. And the major issue was what you and I had talked about, Dirk, is the salesperson would come in and promise us the sun and the moon. And we'd be like, yes, we need, this and this and this. And they'd be like, yep, no problem. But once we got the buy-sell agreement, the attorneys had, not put those things in there. And I was counseling the other owners. I'm like, this is bad. I've worked for corporate America before. And honestly, if it's not written down, it is not going to happen. And sure enough, like we wanted the name to stay for a good 5 years, and they got rid of the name within 6 months. And it was because it wasn't there. So it's kind of exactly what you talked about. So I'm glad that Amy's able to ask you these hard hitting questions because I'm only able to do softball questions.
Well, but you're speaking to a very real issue. Sometimes, unfortunately, the attorneys take over the deal in a way that's, frankly, I don't think appropriate. I mean, we have a job to counsel our clients, explain things to our clients. We may tell them why something would be better or not, but at the end of the day, it's a business deal. And the buyer or seller may be comfortable making a commitment. They recognize that it's part of the trade-off. And it becomes frustrating where the parties are in agreement, but the lawyers are kind of trying to outsmart each other or outcute each other. And all that really does is drive up the price of the process kind of needlessly.
Yeah.
Because you're exchanging drafts back and forth that don't reflect what the parties amongst themselves have said. No, we're comfortable with this commitment.
CMR Consulting proudly sponsors the video recording of insurance suits. You now have a choice of watching or listening to the podcast. Go to YouTube and search for Chantel Roberts or CMR Consulting.
Right. Well, that brings up a really good point. And I knew that 2-page agreement was not going to have everything I thought should be in it. And I had a lengthy conversation with my client who was purchasing the business. I actually had her call the seller and say, please understand the 2-page is not comprehensive enough. And, my attorney would like to, take a stab at drafting an agreement. And I actually had her explain to him, there might be things in there that you don't want. There might be things in there I don't want. Like, don't take offense to what's in there, because I need to have a comprehensive agreement for my own purposes as counsel. That's
Right.
the best interest of my client. he was welcome to get an attorney. He probably should get an attorney, those kinds of things. But at the end of the day, there were provisions that even my client didn't think were important. I guess the point that I'm making, and both of you brought it up, it wasn't my choice to make, though. So when my client says, Amy, I really don't want to put that in there, I think it's going to upset him. And he's, we've kind of worked this out. I trust him, all of that. I said, okay, I would recommend you keep it in.
Mhm.
That's your call to make, not mine. But I made sure I had that process documented,
Right.
so that down the road, if there is an issue, I can say, no, we talked about it. She didn't want it in there, or he was really upset that that was in there and she did not want to deal with that. It's not my call as the lawyer. And if she wanted to take something out that I thought I wouldn't do that, I told her that. But ultimately, I took it out because she didn't want it.
What do you think, Dirk, is one of the major, I guess, problems that you may see, I guess, with the clients? Because in my particular case, when I was pointing these things out, some of the other partners started to feel that I was trying to negate or sabotage or was just against the buy-sell agreement. And actually I wasn't. I was just pointing out that, hey, this protection isn't in the group, thing. And to Amy's point, we're all friends when we're getting ready to sell, or we may all be relatives, but when something goes down badly, that's again when feelings get involved. We may no longer be friends, which would be to the cooperation clause. So I guess what is some of the bad things, I suppose, that could happen?
It's a laundry list, right? It could be as could start right out of the gate with the wrong parties being named to the agreement.
Good
Right,
point.
you think, well, this is the Jones agency. Well, what does that mean? Well, we started an LLC, but then we never really used that, and then we started an S corp. Just getting to the basics of, do you really have the right parties to the contract? Do you have the right parties who have the agreements with the carriers that you're trying to transfer? It can be, you might get in there as a buyer and find that this is not a very clean book of business, right? That the seller was cutting corners, was not really following the proper underwriting requirements, whatever. And if your agreement, 2 pages, there's probably no space for some reps and warranties, we call them, right? Where the seller is
Right.
making certain representations that, again, kind of are like insurance that allow you to go back and say, you told me that you operated in good business practices consistent with the requirements of your carriers. You said that on page 7, and it turns out you didn't. So I paid $4 million for something that's probably only worth $2 million because I've got to get rid of $2 million worth of bad business. I can do that or have a chance to do that if I have that rep in there. I don't have a basis to do that if I just signed something that said I'm buying it, however it is, and I'm taking it however it is. That's what I get. That's certainly something bad that can happen, that we see happen.
I like your the reps and warranties. That's something, has become a hot topic just in general with mergers and acquisitions and reps and warranties insurance. And I've seen an agreement before, and it got done, but the seller of the agency did not want to provide a warranty that the income taxes, the tax returns were accurate.
Ooh.
Now, to that seller's point, he doesn't prepare him, his accountant does. And he thought he was warranting the accuracy, the work of
Right.
his accountant.
Right.
So it's communication and dialogue on some of those things. There's a
Which we
reason.
Well, I'm sorry for interrupting, Amy, but which we've talked about before. And to everybody's point, Dirk, and yours, Amy, is it's really all about reputation in this kind of service industry, which is what insurance is, whether it be the agent, the broker, attorneys, claims adjusters, whatever.
Those reps, right? The tax returns is a good example. You have to explain to people, we understand that you may not, in fact, know that that's true, but you are telling the buyer that if it turns out not to be true, the risk is going to fall on you, not on the buyer.
Right.
And that's the purpose. That's the insurance, is to say, none of us know exactly. We can't say exactly down to every detail how our businesses operate. But we're just saying that if there's a problem that comes up to light after I've sold it, but the problem was from when I owned it, it's going to be my responsibility for some window of time.
Right. Well, and it's usually not going to be a problem, even if there is a difference in valuation. I mean, I look at a situation where they're off by hundreds of thousands of dollars, or they haven't maintained their books properly and tax returns need to be restated. And there's a significant difference in the valuation of the business. If it's a $5,000 error, I'm sure the buyer is not going to take the time to go after this guy, and it's going to not significantly devalue the business. But, it's like any contract, and it's kind of funny. You brought up a good point too, Dirk. Just the name of the parties, it's, people don't always understand that an insurance policy is simply a contract, like a buy-sell agreement is simply a contract. Right. You look at the named insured, make sure you've got the right party who's making the claim, make sure they're an insured on the policy. That's the same, like those fundamental basics, policy term, what consideration was, and what it is that's being purchased, defining that. I mean, I'm a coverage geek, as everyone knows. But I think really I'm a contract geek because I think they're so important to our society and the foundations of our country, that getting those little things right, they're little things, but they have big impacts.
So I would say, if I'm not putting words in your mouth, Dirk, that if the listeners were to take away a nugget from today, that would be one of them, making sure that your name of your parties are correct, that you have reps and warranties. What I'm putting words in your mouth. You talk. This is your interview, not my interview.
No, those are good points. Making sure you have all of the proper parties to the agreement, right? Normally that means if the agency that's being sold is incorporated, which typically it is, you need both the agency, the company as a party, but you also need the principal to be signing that agreement, at least as to certain portions of it, because you need an individual making representations as to, here's how things were operated, or here's things that are going to be true, or here are my personal non-competition, non-solicitation commitments to you, in addition to what the corporation is committing to you. To Amy's point, certainly the insurance provisions are important. Timing can be important, and understanding the ability to expect a certain closing date, or the events that can extend that closing date, or the events that can allow you to get out of the deal.
So what would be one question that I haven't asked you that you wish I would have, and how would you answer that?
I got to think a minute, because I didn't prep for this question. I'm sorry. Oh. I know I somehow I missed the cheat sheet.
Oh.
So
don't tell all the other interviewees that we give them a cheat sheet.
No.
Here's
what you didn't ask me. that's hugely important. And that is tax allocation. And that the
Yes.
parties have an agreement on that going into or as part of the purchase agreement. Because from a seller's perspective, certainly that will dramatically impact the net price. In most agency transactions, there's really not a lot of assets other than the goodwill, the relationship, the contracts being sold. So that should play out well for the seller in terms of it being taxed as a capital gain and not as ordinary income. But a lot of times people don't want to deal with that piece. They don't want to. They're already saying, "Oh, gee, I'm already spending money on attorney, and I really don't like spending money on the attorney." And then you want me to spend money on the CPA or tax attorney too?
Right.
I definitely say you've got to understand and plan and negotiate how the tax implications are going to play out.
Okay.
That's a great point. It's like the elephant in the room,
Yep.
but it's there for a reason.
Yep, for sure.
Where can people find you, Dirk? How can they contact you?
They're probably going to want a phone number after this technical versus my online presence. I can be found at wrightbeamer.com, WRIGHTBEAMER.com, or at 248-477-6300.
Great.
Dirk, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Just thoroughly enjoyed it.
Same here. Thanks for including me.
Great. Talk to you
Okay,
later.
have a great day. Bye-bye.
This wraps up another Insurance Suits podcast. I'm Chantel Roberts, and I'd like to thank my co-host, Amy Johnson, and Dirk Beamer for joining us today. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Please like, follow, and subscribe to Insurance Suits on your favorite distribution channel and give us a review, since this helps push us out to other listeners. If you need insurance consultants or expert witnesses, go to aimco.com. That's AAIMCO.com. Or if you are a consultant or an expert witness, go to our page to learn more about us. We'd love to have you.